well, this workshop in particular is focusing on supporting young people. So we had a bit of that in panel 1, where we were talking about particularly economic inactivity and young people. And now we're going to really dig into that with our panelists, in particular looking at sort of apprenticeship training, support into employment for young people, with a bit of a focus on what works in terms of interventions, and what else is needed to help young people, particularly those who might be further from the labour market. Fantastic. Great. So if everybody can hear me okay, I'm assuming, I'm hoping everyone can hear me, then I think we can get going. And I hope everybody is ready for this workshop. We've got 4 great panelists for this discussion about achieving better outcomes for young people. We've got 45 minutes. We've got time for them to do a bit of a presentation, and then we've got plenty of time for Q&A, and I'll be able to take your questions from everybody joining. So we've got Chris Goulden from the Youth Futures Foundation. We've got Jess Evans, who's a non-exec board member at the Youth Futures Foundation. Sonal Shenai, who's head of employment at Impetus, and we also have Olly Newton, who's executive director at the Edge Foundation. So some really great inputs for everybody there. I'm going to hand over to Chris, the Director of Impact and Evidence at Youth Futures. And Chris, you've got some slides to take us through as well, so hopefully we can see those.
Thanks, Sam.
There we go.
Here we are. Great to be here. So I'll be quick, as we all are going to be. So I'm going to talk about some work that we've done with partners at the Institute for Employment Studies and the Centre for Evidence and Implementation, and also Monash University in Australia, on the Youth Employment Toolkit. And you may have heard our Chief Exec, Barry, speaking about some of this earlier, so I'm going to go into a tiny little bit more detail about what that says, about what works. As we know, what works is a superficially simple question with a lot of depth beneath it. But don't worry, we've been through all of the evidence, well, the teams have, and we've distilled that into bite-sized chunks of information and evidence that we want to share with you. So 2 things that are hard to know about what works are, firstly, what would have happened if you're delivering a program to the young people in the program if you hadn't done the thing that you have done with them. The other thing that's difficult is that if you're delivering a program with lots of components, and you think it's effective, which components were effective, which things made the difference, which things were a waste of time for different kinds of people, and so on. But we have tried to unpick both of those thorny questions in our toolkit. So what it's based on is around 60 high-quality impact evaluations from high-income countries around the planet, and they are all studies that have used some kind of comparison group. So that deals with the first difficult question: what would have happened in the absence of the program itself? And then the second thing that the team have done is a component network meta-analysis. And for those of you that want the details, it's all there on the website. But in essence, what that does is pulls out the components of those complex programs to isolate the individual effect of particular interventions on employment outcomes for young people. So the first slide here is the first summary, and in our toolkit we've looked at 7 interventions to begin with. We want to expand out to cover as many as possible over the coming years, but here we've got the kind of vocational training interventions, apprenticeships, on-the-job training and off-the-job training. And we've boiled that down into kind of 3 different dimensions. So we're looking at the impact of that on employment outcomes. So that's high, medium and low for each of these different categories. So apprenticeships, that's the only one in the toolkit currently that does have, based on the evidence, a high impact on getting young people into unsubsidized jobs at the end of their apprenticeship. And that was a key finding, actually, that a lot of apprenticeship evaluations don't track young people long enough for long enough to see what happens after the end of the apprenticeship, and does that increase their chance of getting into good quality work in the long run. We've also got on-the-job training, off-the-job training. Both of those are moderate impact. We've also looked at evidence strength, which essentially is the kind of number, and they're all high quality studies, but it's essentially the number and the quality and confidence we have in the evidence behind those impact findings. We've also tried to get a handle on the costs, and these reflect, as you'll see if you go onto the website, an assessment of the input costs of these different interventions. We found very few, if any, studies that tried to quantify the costs of the intervention itself, and that's something that we want to do in the evaluations that we are running ourselves as Youth Futures in the future. Next slide, please. So overall, we've looked at 7 interventions. So here's the other 4. So we've covered basic skills training, life skills training, mentoring and coaching, and wage subsidy programs. So you'll see here, these are all low impact, but they're all positive. So we could have found things that had negative impacts, and some other what work centres in their toolkits do find things that are actively harmful. We haven't found anything like that. The other bonus of this approach is that because we've abstracted them from the programs that, as they are delivered, to pull out these particular components, they're all additive. So the more you do, the more the additional effect is on the young people that we're trying to support. And you see here that we've got moderate evidence strength across the toolkit for those interventions, and a range of different input costs. So what we really want to do in the end is to get a sense of that kind of weighing up those costs, those impacts, the cost benefit of different kinds of interventions. We're pulling this together to make sense of it in the UK context, so that we can link this evidence to the interventions that government are putting into place or may want to put into place, so that we can increase the role of evidence in making decisions that are affecting the lives of young people. I'll be very happy to answer any questions you may have about the detail later. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. You kept to time, and there was so much in there that I was thinking, is this the start of a our discussion? But
yeah, this is just the espresso version.
A perfect strength. Thank you very much. Thanks, Chris. So we're going to move on now, and think about all your questions, because you can post them in the chat. There's lots of questions you might want to post to Chris about that. Jess Evans, non-exec board member at YFF. Do you want to go next? Thank you.
Hiya, thank you so much. Really lovely to be here. And I'd firstly just like to say thank you to Chris for running through all that amazing information. And I'd really encourage you all to check out the actual toolkit on the YFF website. My plan is essentially to use this time to have a bit of a chat about the importance of considering the different people involved in this space. So first and foremost, the inclusion of young people and youth voices when we're considering what works in terms of getting young people into education and employment and training. So as the toolkit and the evidence map that Youth Futures has highlights, there are of course sort of like gaps in the evidence. And young people themselves are diverse and multifaceted, with many sort of like changing needs and challenges all the time. So research, although incredibly valuable, might not always capture all of this diversity and might not always keep up with the changing needs of young people. So I'd really like to encourage all organisations working in this space to not only very seriously consider all of the robust evaluations and evidence, but also to speak directly with young people themselves, and to really value their lived experience alongside all this important data. This is particularly important as not only can that give us immense benefits and insight into their lives, but also there's some risks around sort of like creating knowledge like this that is largely inaccessible to young people who might not be able to sort of like understand the research or access the research and evidence. And this could potentially sort of create like a adults know best imbalance, when actually it's really important to sort of like bring young people along with us. And particularly empower them, or consider empowering them with some of this knowledge about what does good youth employment practices look like, what do good training programs and apprenticeships look like, and how can we ensure that these programs are therefore sort of done with young people rather than done to young people. But young people, of course, aren't the only people to consider in this space. I'd also like to invite people to consider about who is really responsible or doing the thinking about these sorts of things in individual organisations. So apprenticeships, for example, but all sorts of youth employment sort of training programs are not only beneficial to young people, they also do have sort of like a clear business benefit in terms of bringing diversity of views. Young people tend to have sort of like a confidence, a passion to be bold and brave and bring new ideas and innovation into the space. So it is clearly beneficial from a strategic point of view. Therefore, it's not just those who are leading on things like EDI or recruitment that should be really in these rooms and thinking about these problems, but actually senior leaders should be considering this, and those considering sort of retention and organisational culture and strategy should really be thinking about how can we get young people into these spaces and how can we support them whilst they're here to not only give them immense benefit, but also bring that dual benefit back to the organisation. And finally, whilst we all sort of like acknowledge the value of evidence, in reality, the evidence could be considered overwhelming. There's lots of different things out there. There's lots of different sources. There might be a bit of a pressure to produce something that is well backed up with evidence and completely perfect. And in doing so, I think there is potentially a danger of the people who are responsible for designing these interventions and executing them feeling a bit anxious, feeling a bit nervous, a bit fearful of getting started. So actually, I'd like everyone to sort of like think about how we might be able to encourage these people to just get started, to embrace the uncertainty and to utilise the resources and knowledge that is out there to the best of their ability, but ultimately adopt a genuine openness to iteration, change and robust evaluation. But in order to do that, they need to get started and really try putting some of these programmes out in the world to support the young people. So as a recap, as we sort of like listen to everyone's perspectives and particularly as we consider the context of the toolkit and that robust evidence, I'd also like to bring the conversation back to people and the people who are executing these things and the young people who are involved. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jess. Absolutely phenomenally important. Young people being at the heart and voices and experience being built into all this. And you stolen my first question in the discussion bit, but I will build on it, which is about how do we get these things started and how do we build on this evidence. So thank you for planting that already so well. Sonal, we're going to come to you, Head of Employment at Impetus, for your sort of few minutes worth of thoughts. Thanks.
Hi everyone, can you all hear me?
I can hear you, Son.
Excellent. Okay, I had some slides, so just waiting for those to load. Okay, brilliant. Thanks for having me here today. I'm just here to tell you a bit about what we've learned at Impetus. And so if we go to the next page, Impetus exists to transform the lives of young people from disadvantaged backgrounds by ensuring they get the right support to succeed in school, work, and life. We do this by providing funding and support to a range of charity partners who help young people into work or work in the area of prevention of NEET outcomes. Our research has found that young people from disadvantaged backgrounds are 50% more likely to be not in education, employment and training than their better off peers, even when they have the same qualification levels. And as Jess said, there are many, many reasons why a young person can become detached from education, employment and training. And so we are constantly learning from our charity partners on what can work. If we go on to the next slide, these are the interventions we are finding that can make a real difference to young people facing disadvantage and helping them to get to work. The first is interventions targeting skills gaps and labour shortages in growth sectors. And we work with a charity, a FE college called Ada, which found that 19% of UK tech workers are from a low socioeconomic background compared with 33% in other industries. And so Ada exists to solve this shortage of skilled young labour and to meet demand for tech jobs in this booming industry. It is absolutely brilliant and unique in supporting disadvantaged young people, women and people from ethnic minority backgrounds into transformational outcomes in the tech sector through a digital-focused sixth form as well as apprenticeships. The second area of interventions is around providing wraparound support and employer links. And we know that disadvantaged young people can lack the skills and social capital to access the job market and to stay in a job. One of our charity partners, Generation, specifically combines technical skills that are demanded by employers and builds wraparound support as well as brokering links between young people and employers to facilitate this transition. The third category I want to talk about is really around providing support for those facing compound disadvantages, because there can, of course, young people might just not face a single barrier. There may be a number of different barriers they face, including being care experienced, for example. And the example that I'd like to highlight here to share with you all is the Resurgo SPEAR program, which supports young people experiencing barriers to employment to access coaching, peer support, and real-life practice opportunities to find and keep work. SPEAR has actually just been evaluated by the government's data lab, and they were found to be extremely effective. Participation in SPEAR reduces a young person's chance of being NEET after a year by 20%. If we move to the next slide, I just wanted to share with you all what else we think needs to be in place. And so Impetus is part of the youth employment group, along with many of our partners here today. And the Youth Employment Group has actually called for a number of different, has actually identified 5 major challenges that form a significant part of the issue, and called for 5 policies, including a national support system to help young people. I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, Sam. So
that is wonderful, Sonal, and
maybe we can leave you all with that there.
Perfect, thank you. Exactly to time. And maybe people can quickly read that through, and maybe we could talk about that in the discussion. Thank you very much, Sonal. So last and again, very much not least, at the end of our panel is Olly Newton, Exec Director at Edge Foundation. Olly, over to you for a few remarks.
Wonderful, thank you. I just popped a couple of links in the chat as well. So I'm going to focus quite a bit on apprenticeships. I was head of apprenticeship strategy at DFE before doing this job, so it's an area that's dear to my heart. I've popped a link in the chat to the skills shortage bulletins that we produce here at the Edge Foundation as well. We've just published our most recent one. It's really summarising some of the fantastic evidence from colleagues around this virtual table and elsewhere, looking at the future of the labour market. And there are some figures in there that really kind of break my heart at the moment. So we've seen apprenticeship starts for under 19s declining by over a quarter, 27% since 2017. The achievement rate is down as well. Disadvantaged students are actually more likely to be interested in apprenticeship options than their peers. But despite that, the evidence from the Sutton Trust suggests that particularly for higher level apprenticeships, they're much less likely to achieve one. So I'd argue that there are kind of 3 key things that we need to do in this space to try and give young people more opportunities. And the first of those is really to start early. And for me, the current kind of narrow approach to the pre-16 curriculum through the EBAC, through Progress 8, through this obsession with written exam results, has really pushed the kind of creative, technical subjects out of the curriculum at that stage. And that's really a real shame, because those are, to borrow a kind of phrase from the academic circles, those are kind of the enabling subjects for some of these technical qualifications for apprenticeships. You know, young people taking design and technology, young people taking a creative art route, and then using that to jump into apprenticeships and T-levels. So we really welcomed some of the elements of the ABS announcement, and more generally the kind of the potential move to more of a baccalaureate type approach. And again, there's a link in the chat to some of the work that we've been doing there. But we're encouraging everyone in this space across the political divide to think about how we can broaden that experience for young people. And we're also got the privilege at the moment with working with Andy Burnham's team in Manchester on their MBAC, their Manchester Baccalaureate, which I think is a key part of that puzzle. There's also some really great stuff in the past there. So things like young apprenticeships, which some of you will remember and love, I hope, could be something to bring back in that space to really give young people an accelerated start. I think the second is really to start shifting the incentives in the apprenticeship system towards young people. There was a lot of talk before yesterday's autumn statement about whether there might be something in there. Obviously, there was an important change to the minimum wage, and we support that. But actually, it didn't really address this issue of kind of re-gearing the apprenticeship program towards young people, which is not the case at the moment. So thinking about some of those levers, could we be pushing for a change to the levy to fully fund under 18s, to partially fund under 25s? Is there a way that we could kind of gear it just so that it's a bit more focused on those young people's opportunities? And finally, the kind of third point I make would be just around T levels. We support them. They're a good program, but I think we just all have to recognise that they're not going to be for everyone. They're not going to be the silver bullet that kind of completely changes this. And we do need to retain those high quality standalone vocational options that give young people the opportunity to blend those with academic qualifications and get a head start. And again, pointing to a good model in another part of the UK, there's a really strong one from Foundation Apprenticeships in Scotland. So some thoughts there about how we could particularly kind of re-gear and just tweak the apprenticeship programme to make sure that it's doing its job in giving young people that really solid start.
Thank you so much, Olly. And I'm glad it's not just me that thought that there was some sort of mooting of potentially putting something in around apprenticeships and incentives for young people, and that didn't appear. Maybe it's being held back, I don't know, but a bit of a disappointment on that front amongst everything. But thank you very much, Olly, for your thoughts. 3 great points there. So now we move to questions, and I hope well, we've had some good questions already coming in, but others, now you've heard from everybody, do send your questions as well, and I can read them in the chat and pose them to the panelists. The first one does come from what you were saying, Jess, which is sort of with the bank of evidence that's being built up, particularly from Youth Futures, which is absolutely fantastic. But we need to think about how do we encourage people to get started? How do we build on the evidence so that we use it, so that we put it into practice? How do we turn it into reality? I'd love to turn to each of the panelists and sort of ask how do we get people to use what works and ultimately enable young people to go through those routes and be able to access, so more young people, particularly those further from the labour market, can access really great support. Jess, I'm going to come to you first, if that's okay, because you sort of posed the question, and I'll be keen on your thoughts, and then I'll go across the panel.
Amazing, thank you. Yeah, so I think there's a bit of a mindset shift at first. This idea that actually just because we want to evaluate something doesn't mean it has to be perfect. There is learning in it not working as much as there is learning in something working. So I think something that we could do is to encourage a bit more of a experimental mindset amongst everybody, employers in particular, who are sort of like trying these sorts of things, that actually getting something out there and being genuinely open to it being evaluated and iterated is better than spending sort of like an extended period of time trying to craft the perfect solution out of fear of evaluation. So really encouraging an openness to evaluation. And then the second point I would say is essentially really putting the value at the heart. So thinking about how much benefit it's going to bring and playing to people's sort of hearts and minds. So not only is this the right thing to do, but also it has a genuine benefit for you. Therefore, it's worth the effort, it's worth the risk, it's worth experimenting.
Yeah, that's some great points there. And I think in the business world, being prepared to fail and pick yourself up and build on it and do something better next time is quite well accepted. And somehow this nervousness around, oh gosh, I'm going to be evaluated, and what if it's not perfect? How do we get that mindset in? Is a great point, really well made. I'm going to turn to you, Sonal, for your thoughts on how do we put all this in practice. I mean, you work with charity partners that are evaluated, that do some of this. How do we do more of it, I suppose?
Oh, it's the $1 million question, of course. Well, at Impetus, we work with our charity partners to help them aim to become benchmark beating, but we know that's a long journey. And we, aim to select charity partners who are really truly focused on working well and with disadvantaged young people and helping them to achieve their potential. They bring a kind of learning mindset, and that is really important in terms of improving on the outcomes they're already achieving. And that is all really important. But ultimately, we also need to know that it's a very fragmented landscape for young people. And that's where we also need more support for a kind of a national strategy, really, because it's so hard being a young person right now. They have enough challenges when they come from disadvantaged backgrounds. They need support from educators and national policymakers to access what already exists.
Yeah, that came to a point that came up in our first panel today, which was around the complexity of the system, both for people young people who want to access training or support, and but also complexity for employers to know what schemes there are and who to contact. I mean, and the aim to be, we need that much more simplified for everybody. So
absolutely, just knowing how to navigate even finding apprenticeships that might suit you, it's pretty much impossible when you're young. I mean, let alone as a parent or as someone who's an ally.
Yeah, when you have mentors and advocates who try and help and then find it tricky. I'm going to turn to you, Olly, on this question. I don't know if you have any thoughts to share, and then I'll turn to you, Chris.
I certainly do. So just to reflect on Jess's point, I thought I was spot on, but I just wanted to relate that back to policymakers as well, because there just isn't any opportunity with my old hat on as a policymaker to try something, because it's got to be perfect first time. So you're scared to then try anything. There's a real kind of collective memory loss in the policy world as well. We've been trying to address that through our learning from the past work, and I'll pop a link to the chat in that in a moment. But because policymakers tend to move on quickly, we absolutely have to provide some corporate memory so we don't just try the same things and forget about them. But yeah, I think that was spot on, Jess. And I just wanted to add one extra point, which was just collaborate. Like as Sonal saying, cross-party. We need collaboration so that we're not just changing things for the sake of it when government changes. Cross-organisation in the way that Impetus and others and Youth Futures are kind of encouraging, but also cross-sector. Some of the work that we're doing at the moment, talking to primary school educators and then bringing some of their pedagogy into FE or vice versa. That can be really exciting. Obviously, you have to change the content a little bit, but actually, there's some great things that different sectors, the youth sector and the education sector, can learn from each other as well.
Oh, that's fantastically interesting, and yeah, because we should be trying to make smooth journeys and pathways and smooth all of this stuff out for everybody. Yeah, fantastic. And Chris, to you, this is your your toolkit, it's Youth Futures toolkit. How do we enable more use of it to get more routes for young people?
Well, hopefully it's everybody's toolkit, because it's there as a public service and freely available, and we are desperate for feedback on it, because thinking about the question, there are just so many bridges from funding to practice to evaluation to relationships with policymakers to policymaking to the political cycle that are all part of the system that we're trying to affect to improve outcomes ultimately for young people. And I think having that sort of agile design mindset is so important to build into all of those processes, but often the stakes are so high, as people have said, that the risk of failure, it's not safe to fail. But we've been trying to encourage that way of thinking in the evaluations and the work we're doing and with our partners to create that safe space, because we have the luxury of some resources to be able to do that helps to create that space for learning that then can be fed hopefully more safely into that process. But yeah, we're really keen to do more user research with the toolkit, and we've got a project we're going to start next year that's going to go out and ask people who have seen it and who haven't seen it, and how we can really get it into practice, because this is just the start of it. We've kind of distilled that global evidence, but we know that it needs a lot more work and a lot more kind of diverse outputs for different audiences, including employers that we want to get to, before it's really kind of starting to make a difference in all those decisions within that system. But I think we can feed that in, and we want to expand beyond the 7 that we've got to start with as well. So hopefully it gets more and more useful, there's more and more feedback, and there's this kind of positive cycle that makes it more useful over time.
That's great to hear that it's literally the start, the foothills. It's about getting, and that's your your great role in the youth employment sector as Youth Futures to be able to do that. And you've had some fantastic feedback right at the start of this meeting from the West
I know,
Midlands.
I've already clipped that and sent it to our head of research. So that's exactly what we want to hear. And
put it on your end of year appraisal. That it's been used for the deep dive work on youth unemployment, which is exactly what it's been intended for.
Yeah, and just one thing to add is that our own evaluations that we're funding will feed into the toolkit when they get results. And a problem with the toolkit is of those 60 from high-income countries around the world that have been done in the last 30 years, that's not that many, not many done in England. So that translation into the English context, which is constantly shifting and will shift again, over the next decade or so, that has to be part of our offer to help people interpret and make sense of it. So that the sort of wraparound work needs to happen as well.
So will the evaluations as they come through, will they be built into the toolkit? So the toolkit will.
Yeah. So there's a process of adding to the studies that form that analysis for the toolkit, and then it'll just be like a growing blob of evidence, and everything will get fed in, and then ultimately take over the world. So
an extremely used to the blob.
Yeah.
Well, what works will take over the world. That would be a great day, wouldn't it? Fabulous. Thank you very much all for your thoughts on that. So turning to this, another question that was posed, which I think you've answered a little bit in the chat, Chris, but we can dig in a bit more, which is this part about co-creation of policy around youth unemployment with young people, and Jess, a point that you made right at the start. How do we balance that? Well, there's a diversity of experience from young. There is no one young person's experience. There's a huge diversity of experience that needs to be captured, fed in, at all stages. And how do you balance that with sort of, well, the question that was posed with impactful policy, but also, I suppose, what we've seen in particularly around the pandemic is fast-paced policy making as well, and how we balance all of those things up to make the best policy outcomes that we can have. Chris, do you want to start? As soon as I came to you last time and you're on the screen, you started on the chat around that, about sort of how you've done it at Youth Futures, some learnings from that.
Yeah, because I think participation of people with experience of the issue that an organisation is working on is different, and there are difficulties with doing that within a What Works centre, because in some senses this is just a caricature, but the objective evidence is the sort of scientific method is on one side, and the direct kind of personal experience is on the other, and how to reconcile those is a challenge. But I think the way through that is for young people with experience of the issues that we're looking into are helping us make decisions about what we do. So it's Bill, as Jess does, sat on our board helping us make kind of key decisions and program decisions and decisions on the project, like the toolkit, about how we present that. And there's a whole range of stakeholders where young people have to be there at the table with kind of equal authority to help make decisions. And I think that for us seemed like the best way through. But there's still a long way to go. And we are supporting government departments to do that a bit more. So we have an initiative across the three kind of main departments that are looking at youth employment, to help them engage in a similar fashion with a group of young people. But we're all young once, and there's so many young people out there. There's so many experiences. I think it's marrying that global understanding through research and evidence with that direct personal experience, because just one story can be powerful enough and give you insights into those processes and structures. They've got the stories and the data have got to be married together, I think.
I think that's a really interesting place that Youth Futures is arriving at, and leading the way and helping. And that's great that you're helping government departments to do the same. As you say, that there is
not just us, with Youth Employment UK as well, I should add.
With Youth Employment UK, fabulous. I think that yes, of course, that there is a power there. There's a power in evidence, and there's a power in experience as well. And I think, especially in reaching young people that aren't normally the loudest voices, shouting about their experiences, finding the quietest voices who aren't being heard is really important. Olly, I'm going to turn to you on this one as well.
Yeah, this is really important, and we have a really vocal youth network as well. Just a few reflections from me. I think as we've said, we all know this. It needs to be those kind of real opportunities to share experience, not kind of a tokenistic thing. But I think there's also a really important point that Chris is kind of just touching on there around, we all know, and I've seen working with various ministers over the years, the power of anecdote. Oh, well, my nephew, this is their experience, or my one constituent, this is their experience. So I'm going to put that as my reference point and ignore all of the evidence. But I think the way that we do that is to treat those young people as part of the team, to share the evidence with them, to talk it through, so that we're all understanding, what's anecdote, what are people's lived experience, and then also what does the wider evidence say, so that we can be kind of talking about that, as a group of experts with different lived experience. I wanted to just make a plea for a particular kind of diversity in the young people that we talk to. Obviously, diversity in all its characteristics is really important, but one that I think often gets left out in policy making is we tend to have an urban focus for everything, and we've got this wonderful group of young people. Just to give one example, I was working with the Young Islanders Network last week. We do some work with islands around the UK, and I was talking to a young woman who's the only young person on the island that she lives in Scotland. So when policymakers are like, oh, why don't you go to your local FE college and do a T-level? It's like, well, that doesn't compute. That's like a ferry away. So just thinking about, obviously that's an extreme example, but rural, coastal, I think sometimes gets left out of the kind of policy discourse, both from a kind of broader policy making and from kind of selecting and bringing in young people's voice.
Absolutely right, and something that you hear all the time around transport and young people, and in different areas you're going to face much more extreme challenges in actually accessing support and how you do it. So fabulous, thanks Olly, really interesting. Gosh, that's going to stick in my mind, that example of getting a ferry to a cottage. Sonal, I'm going to come to you, and then Jess, I'll turn to you as you sort of posed the original question. Sonal.
Thanks. I think everyone said made so many valuable contributions already, and I was going to also echo rural as a really important one. I think that the final thing I'd say is it's really important, of course, to learn from what young people need, but also to get things to them. And so outreach and actually having the ability to reach young people in the first place, to help them navigate the complexities of the system, and having trusted advisors who can really build relationships with them to do this work. Yes, absolutely, youth hubs. And as well as educators and kind of trusted adults in their lives, that can be absolutely crucial in helping them actually overcome those barriers and to engage in the opportunities that do exist.
And access them. Yeah, that's right. Just what are your thoughts on this sort of balancing and bringing in and diversity, and what's your?
Yeah, so I think firstly just to say that I think Chris is exactly right in terms of not viewing like evidence and young people's experience as polar opposites, but finding ways to marry the two and value experience in a different way, but equally alongside lots of the evidence. But in terms of things like ways of getting young people involved, I think one of the key pillars is sort of involving young people right from the start. Olly mentioned it not being tokenistic, like making sure that there is still opportunity for them to genuinely influence, rather than sort of like getting far down the line to the point where you're going for approval rather than genuine input. Another one related to that is sort of in really investing in young people. So particularly on the diversity point, lots of the young people that we ideally want to be talking to are those sort of like furthest from these spaces who might find it most difficult to engage. And they might have had quite sort of vulnerable experiences that they're willing to share. And as a result, there's a need to essentially invest in them. So pay them is a really great way to get started. And sadly, not many organizations who are consulting young people actually do that. But if you can't afford to pay them, there are other ways in terms of like increasing their development, giving them opportunities to like really train, empower them with the knowledge in order to effectively engage in these spaces. And on that point, I think my final bit of sort of like advice would be to really engage with youth organizations who perhaps aren't in the employment space, but are experts in youth voice and engaging with young people. There's lots of youth voice guidance out there, both for policymakers and for various organizations, and there are young people like me and many others who would be more than happy to sort of like speak to you about best ways to engage with young people.
Is that point about collaboration again, which is so important, and not duplicating the expertise of another organisation, working with them, and ensuring that you can work together to try and go even further and maximise. And it's interesting, this point about the power of a story. I remember a conversation with a minister where we had a group of young people, and one of them had gone into so many different jobs and fallen out of work because of certain barriers that that person faced. And the minister just overtook the meeting with trying to support this young person. Have you thought about this job? Have you tried to do this? And after the meeting said, can we help this young person to get a job, please? And it's like, that's great. That's very, very involved, and that's brilliant. And that is a power, but it's also a wider thing that you are a minister and you have more power over policy to do, you know, bring about wider changes as well. But all of these things, bringing them together and ensuring that young people are brought in from the start is absolutely key. So we've got 5 minutes for 5 minutes. So what have we got? We've got 1 minute each. I posed the question in panel 1, and I think I'm going to pose it to you, but focused on young people. So 2024, really, really busy year. What do you think is the biggest opportunity and challenge of 2024 in terms of support for young people? Chris, I'm going to start with you.
Thanks. Probably political change of one sort or another is inevitable, I think, and maintaining focus on kind of underlying issues that we have in this country that are affecting young people and preventing many marginalized young people from getting into good quality careers and jobs. That doesn't really depend on the political cycle. It's been with us for 10, 20 years. So it's maintaining the focus on that underlying issue amidst the political churn. I think that's where we'll probably be focusing. And, you know, using evidence-based ways of engaging with policymakers is a way of kind of doing some of that. It's not perfect, and other things matter too, definitely. But yeah, I'm hopeful that the work we're doing and we've done with partners can really start to make a difference.
I suppose there's an opportunity and a challenge, making sure that these things come to the fore and aren't overlooked as amongst the tumult of things that will be going on next year. Great. And I'm going to go down the panel as you spoke. So Jess, I'm going to come to you next. Opportunity challenge in 2024.
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest challenges will be that there'll be lots of young people who experience the knock-on effects of the pandemic. Even though it feels like quite a long time ago, they're now going to be sort of like coming out of school and into work, and how do we as like help them? And in terms of the opportunity related to that, I think is that actually it invites us to consider new ways of working and what these young people are used to in terms of like virtual and digital. How can we really like leverage that, and not just as things begin to calm down and we return to normality, how can we not just return to normality, but actually use some of those things to better our interventions?
And so actually making progress. Do you know what? Those were 2 of my other questions I didn't get around to. It's amazing, Jess. You're just so in synergy. It was about, are the challenges changed now post-pandemic? And what's about how do we build on the progress that was made, focused on youth unemployment? So there we go. You've covered those. Sonal, I'll come to you next, and then Olly.
Thank you. I just echoing really what others have already said. I'd say, you know, the continued high need of young people out there, and particularly people who are furthest from the labour market, that's continues to be a challenge in the context that we're in. And my hope is that young people's needs are prioritised by policymakers, whoever wins the next election, and that there will be increased support for them. So fingers crossed, and obviously we will all watch this space.
We'll all be trying to get to that position. Olly, to wrap up.
I think challenge would be trying to make sure that this area stays at the top of the agenda when there is so much going on in the global space and the domestic space. I think the flip side and the opportunity is to try and just make clear where this feeds into everything else. And I just hark back to listening to David Blunkett at the Labour conference recently, and he was talking about, you know, this underlies all of the Labour Party's missions, because making healthcare work, you know, making the environment work, that's all about upskilling young people to do those jobs that are going to make that happen. So I think there is a narrative there, but I think that is the challenge for us all over the next year.
I think that's exactly right. I think that there's an opportunity in that focus, but the challenge being that we don't get drawn into that sort of programitis that we've had in government, and a program for this, a program for that. How does it all join together? How do we make this all work seamlessly for young people? It's such a great panel, so much ground covered, and so many important points to capture as well. Thank you so much, Chris, Jess, Sonal and Olly. Absolutely brilliant panelists you've been, and for answering all the questions so well. Thank you. You didn't even know what they were going to be, and you handled them spectacularly. Thank you. Now I'm going to encourage everybody to move back to the summit. You can access the link to that on the Learning and Work website, and the whole Employment Support Summit is going to wrap up for the morning. Thank you so much, panelists. We'll see you all soon. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.